Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our series Fintech Fridays, brought to you by BDO Australia. In our webinar today, we'll be discussing open banking, the future of finance, and beyond. My name is Tim Aman. I'm BDO's Global Fintech Leader, as well as our National Financial Services Leader. Before we kick things off, I would just like to quickly draw your attention to the housekeeping slide that is currently showing on your screen. To start, you are all automatically muted, but we'll be accepting questions throughout the session, and you can submit these using the question tab. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. However, if we cannot respond to your question, we'll follow up with you after the webinar concludes. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please click the support button, which is one of the bottom tabs on your screen. And finally, this session is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email containing the slides, a link to the recording, access to register for future sessions, and speaker contact details for all of us. Today, we continue our discussion on Australia's journey toward open banking, which is centered on the Consumer Data Right, or CDR, legislation. Despite a slow start, there's been some positive changes occurring. In the macro context, the pandemic has driven digital demands, but on a micro level, we are starting to see more recipients each month, with 12 accredited data recipients in April. It's expected that within 3 to 5 years, open banking will reach its envisioned potential. Earlier this month, the federal budget announced the allocation of $113 million investment into the rollout of the CDR. Treasury have also announced a number of proposed changes to rules. However, there's a lot of learnings and challenges along the way. On the panel today, I'm joined by Data Right expert Jill Berry, founder and chief executive officer of Adatree. Adatree is a fintech that helps organizations gain access to open banking, offer a scalable technology platform for companies to access and leverage data accessible through a single API. Adatree is also the first startup to become an accredited data recipient, or ADA, the first company accredited with a female CEO, and the first solely CDR-focused technology provider. It's no surprise I've also been nominated as a finalist in 7 categories in the Finnies. Welcome, Jill. I'm also joined by Mark Griffiths, our risk advisory services partner here at BDO Australia. He's been a partner and with the firm for over 24 years. Welcome both.
Thank you.
And I think as everyone remembers from last time, Jill is from Buffalo, as am I. And so it's one of the few times we get to outnumber people. So it's 2 Buffalo people and someone from Wales. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I feel honored to be amongst you this morning.
Thank you. So first, why don't we switch over, Jill, and talk a little bit about the success of Adatree. We spoke about six months ago. And at that time, you had made quite an impact over the past 6 months. You'd been in the Fin Review, February 25th, 2021. You became an officially recognized ADR by the ACCC. Adatree is one of the few active ADRs, meaning you can start receiving CDR data. Can you tell me a little bit about the last 6 months?
Oh yeah, this past 6 months have been an absolute blur. I can't believe how fast it's gone. Yeah, so we are accredited as a data recipient in February. So that's essentially the process to, it's a milestone in the journey of receiving CDR data. It's a very important milestone, but you still can't receive data without it. I think it was about 2 weeks ago now. We also received the active status, so being the 4th company in Australia to receive that. So being active means that you actually can receive data. It means that you've passed all of the conformance testing. So it means that technically you're all there to manage data throughout the life cycle. So there's those achievements. We've been scaling up the team. We're up to 10 now. We're quite talent dense. Yeah, I think that we're really working on our strategy, or bringing our strategy to life about leveraging data and focusing so much on the automation of onboarding customers. There's lots of strides that we're making internally, but the external excitement is like really ramping up. So that's why we're investing so much into infrastructure, scalability, automation, just so if we want to onboard a couple of companies each day while still building out our roadmap, we can.
That's fantastic. I mean, I think when we talked 6 months ago, a lot seems to have happened in 6 months. I know you went back to the States for a little while, and I guess how difficult was it to be able to run the company, back in the US, I guess, particularly as you're going through this accreditation process?
Yeah, it was interesting because not many people knew that I was actually there, but I got to split with the time difference, I got to split my day into like the first half of my day was actually incredibly productive, with no meetings, no phone calls, no emails at all, because it was essentially 2 to 7 a.m. Here. So it was like my productivity level was actually incredibly high, and then just made sure that my meetings were just in the first half of the Australian day. So it was pretty compartmentalized, and I don't know, I feel like I kind of wish I could do that ongoing now, just have half a meeting day and have a productivity day.
Sounds great, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Take a leaf out of your book there, Jill.
Yeah, getting things done.
I think that'd be good for you, Mark.
Yeah, agreed.
That'd be good. So I guess in terms of what, are you starting to get a sense from your clients what this is meaning that now that you're accredited? So now that you've gone active, I guess, has it been a flurry and uptick of excitement with your clients? And I guess, what do we expect in the next month or so from you?
Yeah, there's been a lot of questions about, oh, you've been through the process. What does it actually look like? What are all the different steps? And we've definitely learned along the way with our own journey, and of course, like some of our clients going through the process. So we've kind of like ironed out some of the bugs, the questions, a lot of the onboarding, and even companies preparing for their own accreditation as well. So ultimately now if someone's like, oh, I want to get accredited, how can I do it as fast as possible? Because no one really says, I'd like to do it in 18 months. Let's have a slow program. Everyone's like, I want to run. So we're like, all right. So we've actually just come out with like a project management plan for it.
Okay.
Just like running like the technical streams, the business streams, because the last thing you would want is have 98% done for your application, and like you're ready to submit and you're just waiting on like one extra piece of information. So that's how we kind of like recommend it. So it's like that, like business readiness part of it as well, is we have like the technical platform, but that's actually later on in the value chain. So it's like, how can we help throughout the whole process? And
great to hear that.
Well, I think it's sort of, we'll touch on a little bit about some of the lessons learned, but obviously I think people will be looking for you in terms of how can you accelerate. And I guess maybe you can talk a little bit about your Accelerator program and a little bit about your partnership with DNX Solutions.
Yeah, so is like part of some of the questions are, oh, how do I be a data recipient as fast as possible? Who do I have to work with? It's always a balance of what do I do myself? Who do I work with, so you can really get like the best value for your time, money, and internal resources as well, of course. So we work with DNX Solutions. They're an AWS advanced consulting partner, basically specializing in cloud infrastructure and DevOps, things that I definitely don't specialize in. So they're quite complementary to us. So if you're like preparing for your audit, your ASAE 3150, the auditor definitely looks at like your CDR boundaries and where you store your CDR data. They essentially have to treat it like kryptonite, and it has to be in a CDR data environment. So we're like, oh, you can build it yourself, or DNX. They've worked with like 4 of our clients now to build. They have a turnkey CDR compliant environment. So it's the same thing. It's like, I'm sure companies, they have engineering resources, they could do it themselves, but since they've done it for a number of our clients, they actually sit alongside the auditors as well, or even if there's any regulatory questions, just so they know, this is what's actually expected, this is how to just really accelerate that portion of it. So they do the infrastructure, and then we do the technology piece.
Okay, good. And I guess just a little bit in terms of, are you working on any other products that are going to be coming to the market that you can share with people today?
Definitely. So we're really focusing on, so we have like the platform to help companies access the data. Our most popular product right now is the Industry Sandbox, which is the developer environment, because that's the big missing piece of the CDR ecosystem right now. It's like, all right, being accredited is one thing, but how do I actually test out my value proposition? How do I have a proof of concept or an experiment beforehand? So customers are definitely using that. Once they get accredited, that's great, but it's also a question of how do they actually leverage the data as well? And how can we make it in a scalable, configurable way? Because someone might have a use case that this type of data intelligence or different capabilities actually relevant for, and someone actually doesn't, someone else doesn't really care about it, or they have their own capabilities, or it's not relevant to their use case. So we're really focusing on like account and customer verification, and just looking at what are the common use cases that we have, what are the building blocks that really make up those use cases, and the capabilities to leverage that. Kind of treating like a breakfast menu of, do you want this type of verification? Do you want a switching journey? Do you want an onboarding journey? So you can kind of pick and choose what's relevant to your company. And then also partnering with payments, data intelligence companies, realizing that, we don't have the bandwidth or expertise to do everything ourselves. So just partnering with the best in breed companies in Australia as additional add-ons.
Well, partnering, I think is, I've got another webinar session following up from Intersect last week on partnerships. And so I think when you go through the process of deciding who you're going to work with, what's some of your thought process there?
Yeah, it's things that we talk about all the time, actually. Is on paper, it's like, oh, say if we're looking for a data intelligence partner, thinking about what problems does this actually solve? What's their roadmap? What's their success rate? Why are they the best in market? But also, of course, just we look at like a market scan for it, but then also thinking about who's really complementary to us from a technology perspective, but also culture. Because even if someone has the best tech, they might not be someone that you might want to, you might not want to work with them. Yeah. So just looking at those type of aspects of it, and I feel like especially the culture part, like that's harder to, it's really harder to check for, say, on a spreadsheet, right? Yeah. So that one's really, really important, especially if we're having a technical integration. If they're going to be a part of our breakfast menu pretty permanently, we really have to assess that. So that's a big process that we've been going for. It's like largely in the data intelligence space, but there's some wonderful Australian and partners out there that we'll be announcing soon.
Good. Okay, Mark, I guess what are you seeing? I guess I know we talked about open banking and probably again 6 months, 9 months ago. I think there was a belief that things would be moving a bit quicker. Things have probably gone a bit slower, but are you starting to see more and more requests from clients that you're talking to on this subject?
Yeah, Tim, absolutely. And I think Instinct, I think they'll should take advantage of talking to Jill. I think that's probably going to be one of the things that I'll talk to them about, Jill, if you don't mind, after this session. But absolutely, I think, Tim, that they all kind of expected to be much further ahead than they are at this point. And probably they're not, because they've really tried to do too much themselves, I think is my experience. So we've been helping them with their accreditation process and getting them ready from a information security control perspective, and all the great governance things that I'm really passionate about and helping them with. But I think they've really tried to just do too much themselves, not look at those partnerships, and I think they'll see greater value from partnerships and looking to others that have been successful, already gone through that process. But I think also they're also seeing accreditation as the go, and I think that's where we're trying to really get them to understand that that's just the starting point. There's so much more to be done beyond that.
Yep.
And with the partnerships that they could be looking towards, there's a hesitance there to do so, I would suggest. And we're trying to encourage them to look beyond their own house, if you like, to get the support that they need to progress that much quicker.
I think it's an interesting point that you both raised about collaboration and partnerships, because I think there's an element of trust that has to happen. I do think sometimes in the community there's a feeling that we can do it ourselves, or we're going to be able to quickly leverage what someone else has done. I do think there's the accreditation is almost just the entry to the game, and so I think, and then I think Jill, to your point, people are trying to figure out then what do you do with that. As once you're into the game. Yes. I guess maybe we'll just talk a little bit about the reality of becoming a data recipient, because again, on paper, that's a nice aspirational goal. I guess maybe you can talk a little bit about the journey, I guess, in terms of some people have talked about it. It's a very onerous and costly process. And, from a fintech perspective, sometimes there's not a lot of extra cash sort of sitting around to go through this process. And then obviously there's the level of assurance that's required. So maybe you can just talk to me a little bit about your particular journey. And I guess, are the cost estimates that have been put out there about $250,000 to complete an ADR and another 50 to 70K for data storage in line with what you've occurred, or are you starting to see the cost coming down?
Yeah, I definitely have experiences doing this and talk to our clients all the time because they're there not to put their full-time effort into being a data recipient. They want to run their businesses, and being a data recipient is just a tool to help achieve their goals and help solve problems for customers. So of course they have to prioritize their money, their resources, and time like everyone else. So we get that question all the time. I think answering the last question first, are those numbers in line with what we're seeing and what we've experienced? Yep. Absolutely not. No way. I think that from what we've been seeing, like you can always find someone to quote you a whole lot more. What like the customers that we're talking to, it's five figures for accreditation. It's definitely less than 100,000. And for us, it would be like significantly less than that. Naturally, if we do focus on CDR, we are close to the rules. And we were definitely I mentioned that we would have been a harder case for the ACCC to talk about in the application. You have to define your use case. Like what benefits is going to bring for consumers? How many end consumers do you plan on, do you expect to actually use this? And we said, we don't have a use case.
What did they say? Yeah. Were they happy?
Well, I mean, didn't ask.
Yeah.
I got accredited. No, I don't have a use case. I just enable others.
Yeah.
So we're a platform. So technically we can have our use cases. That's definitely in the pipeline, but it's a lower priority. Really, largely focusing on like corporates and institutions, looking at those B2B efficiencies, not necessarily B2C. So that's also really where my passion lies, about helping businesses.
So I guess in terms of for people that are listening that are thinking of becoming accredited, what's probably a realistic budget? And I guess, in discussions with the ACCC, you weren't really focused on the use case, but do you think that that's not going to be the same experience for other people that are trying to become accredited?
Oh yeah, I was absolutely the anomaly with that. Everyone has to have a use case. I feel like that's in the end-to-end process. Defining your use case, thinking about what data you need, what partners you need to have, where that data goes, looking at the data flows. Is it raw data? Do you need to use a different company to enhance it, to analyze it, to do something with? Because then they have to be an OSP, an outsourced service provider, and meet certain technical requirements as well. We're going through the OSP process with someone right now. So it's definitely easier for them to be an OSP than an ADR. So I think that defining that use case upfront is really important. Even though a company might say, "Oh, I have 35," that's great. But I would always recommend to start with the most simple one upfront, and then once you're accredited, then you can add more use cases as you go. Sure, because we've definitely seen people having some pretty complicated ones up front, just with de-identification data and sharing with different parties and in like having it access in so many different parts of their internal system. That just complicates things. I mean, it can be done totally, but I think that just keeping it simple initially would probably make a faster and honestly lower cost way forward, and then you can increase in complexity once you actually are accredited and active.
Would you also recommend a less number of OSPs, I guess, because I guess it's very, very topical. I guess Mark, you'd probably see this as well in terms of a lot of our clients. You've got to look at the outsourcing model and look at the different controls around that. But I guess Mark, do you have any view on that? And then Jill, I guess in terms of as people are getting up and running, trying to limit the amount of outsourcing connections.
I think it's just the understanding, Tim, of what the expectations are of those outsourced service providers. So I think Jill's right. It's it is easier for them in terms of, they're not going through the full accreditation process themselves, but I guess they're understanding from them that they have to be equally as compliant in terms of their controls and understanding of the data that they have and hold and how are they utilizing it. And with those outsourced service providers is, if some of those are also in different jurisdictions, how are they actually then making sure that they're going to be compliant in that regard? And so we've probably recently had more inquiries actually from those than those wanting to get accredited as a data recipient, because they want to play, they want to work with people like Jill and others, but they're not quite sure in terms of, well, to what extent do they then need to demonstrate that they're going to fulfill their obligations, because they don't understand, I guess, their environment as well as they could.
Yeah, no, I think that it is onerous for them, but at the same time, it's also just good governance. It's good security. And it's a great question to be like, oh, tell me about, like your data storage. So ultimately, then you're a better vendor, you're a better supplier, and then you also avoid those headlines that someone just, made your S3 bucket public.
Yeah, look, I agree, and I think it's shifting the mindset. So part of conversations that we've been having is about shifting the mindset away from one. You haven't put a tick in the box, so to speak, to really understand the benefits to you or to them as a business anyway, in terms of improving governance more broadly. I'm really passionate about governance, so that's a great area that I really want them to focus on from that perspective. So yeah, they're certainly taking that advice and suggestions on board.
So I guess, Jill, you probably answered this in the way that I'd expect, but I guess as an early adopter, do you feel you have a real competitive advantage? And I guess, where do you think the tipping point is going to be in terms of competitive advantage? When we have 25 accredited companies, do you think 100? What's your view in terms of, obviously you're one of the first?
Well, I think that I have a very different competitive advantage to the other data recipients. The other data recipients, they would have a competitive advantage because they're ultimately they're first in, they're early adopter, and a lot of them are getting a lot of PR out of it as well. Like just being very upfront about that. But it's also even better for their customers. It shows that they're really forward looking. That often companies adopt screen scraping. Not because they necessarily want their customers to have to share their passwords, but it's a necessary thing to be done because there hasn't been an alternative. It's really showing that they do care about their customers, and they do that they are investing in the future as well. So, when thinking about the adoption curve, they're the ones that are like, oh, we're late in the journey. This is an investment, but we have to do it sooner rather than later. So let's just do it up front. Even now, in July and probably July, August, should be 84 other ADIs starting to share data. So your target addressable market is something massive. But I think that where they'll really see a competitive advantage is bringing their use cases to life. So many of them about decreasing their own costs, but having a better customer experience, decreasing leakage in their funnel, customer acquisition, and just having overall a cheaper onboarding or assessment process. A lot of those have to do with an ROI, bottom line costs, and for lending as well. So if you can start to adopt that, I think that's where bringing our use cases to life really quickly. Look at Finder. They're the first comparison site to be accredited. That really puts them ahead of the pack. And I feel like it also really marks the transition from a comparison company to a data company as well. Especially with energy telco being designated, and surely that insurance and superannuation that's coming as well.
Yep.
So especially if you're a person working with your product strategy, it really opens up with all these different data sets that are coming along, and just being at the forefront of it. So later you can actually focus on what are we going to do with the data. We've already done the work to actually essentially open up that gateway, and they can worry about it just like focus on the fun stuff, the good stuff, you know.
So I guess in terms of the fun stuff, the good stuff, what are you seeing in terms of your clients? What are some of the things that are going to be, people are going to be exposed to first, do you think?
I feel like it's not the most exciting use case, but it's impactful just about like the fast loan onboarding, like the loan assessments. I think that like those we're talking to a number of banks and non-bank lenders for that. I think that not the most exciting, but those are going to be the first use cases being brought to life. But also looking at the idea of credit monitoring, because this is a wonderful real-time capability that it's not just an assessment and let me know when, later we'll talk to you in the credit or defaults team once you have an issue. But now you can actually really monitor like the health of someone's loan, like their salary, their financial position along the way. And I think that it now looks at lending as a life cycle instead of a point-in-time transaction.
I'm smirking to myself because I'm going through a loan approval process. So I'm thinking, I'm not sure they want to be following the life cycle, so, because I think right now that the challenge with loan approval process is everyone builds up to get that loan approval process, and there's a lot of data that comes into it. And then obviously then what happens? Once you've got the loan approval, I think it's going to be great that, the banks can look to monitor, and obviously you as a person can look to monitor this as well. So I think that's going to be quite good. You talked a little bit about, data scraping. Do you think that there's going to be a change in the way that data is captured? Do you think there's anything coming on the horizon?
I wouldn't be surprised at all if that eventually it is banned in Australia the same way it's been banned in the UK.
Yeah.
I think that the Fintech Australia submissions have been incredibly clear that if you were to ban it right now, it would actually be to the detriment of Australian consumers and in Australian businesses, just because the CDR isn't mature enough yet. But I think that what's going to be happening in about 2 months is that all other ADIs are coming online and they're sharing so many different types of data sets very soon, like even with like the opt-out model for joint accounts. That's really, really good for just including more different types of data clusters or like types of data product sets, and also including more different types of not just single individual customers, but joint accounts, business accounts, complex entities. As soon as you have, and then you can even access things like, or you will be able to access things like closed accounts. Well, that'll be really interesting. You definitely can't do that with screen scraping. That'll be a big challenge for the banks.
Yeah.
So I think that soon we'll be hitting stride in maturity. And once you can have like a very viable alternative to screen scraping, I think there'll be like a market pull and a regulator pull. I hope that regulators will will probably ban it like in the UK, but also the market pull. If you're just like, there's a lot of lenders out there, so I'd rather go with, this is my personal view, I'd rather go with one that's doing the right thing with like the regulated ecosystem instead of the one that's just asking me to share my password and increase liability in the outside.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to watch this space, because I think I would agree that it will happen. Mark, I'm not sure if you have a particular view on
it. Look, I think it's inevitable, isn't it? But I mean, you're right about the timing. If you think about not just the financial services industry, but if you think about the other industries that are coming on board, if that was to happen prior to others coming on board, then it would be detrimental to the consumer, I would have thought.
Yeah.
And that's really the benefit, isn't it? Giving us some choice. And
given the name of it, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you would think so. Yeah. I guess before Mark, we talk a little bit about assurance. Jill, anything in terms of, now that you're accredited, and you look back on the journey from a post-implementation review, is there anything you would have done, differently, or advice you can give to people that are starting that journey now?
That's interesting. Bit of a on the spot PIR. Let's see. What would I have done differently? Like nothing really for conformance testing, because we passed all that really quickly. I think that this sounds like pretty much like the most boring response possible. But it's probably also a great segue into what you were doing, or what are you doing? I probably familiarize myself more with the technical requirements in Schedule 2, Part 2, of looking at all the technical controls. As I really looked at, all like the business policies, processes, documents, application, insurances, fit and proper, all of that. And until we really dove into our information security assurance report, I wasn't like, I really didn't appreciate the full breadth of controls. Luckily, we implemented them like quite quickly because I've always worked in a regulated environment, so nothing was particularly surprising. Just to make sure that we get everything going, because there's probably like 60% technical controls and 40% non-technical ones. So having to do like those type of programs as well. So probably familiarizing myself with Schedule 2, Part 2.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mark, maybe that's a good segue into, maybe you can walk us through a little bit about some of the assurance parts about becoming a data recipient.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. And look, I guess in some ways, the ACCC has actually been quite helpful here in regards to the CDR rules, and so Jill's alluded to it there in terms of the two parts there to becoming accredited, and they're set out in the rules quite nicely. The first part is the governance area. I guess that's one that I'm quite passionate about, as I've said already. But that is around your policies, your procedures, all those great things. But actually, the key thing is probably understanding the boundaries of the CDR data environment, and Jill alluded to that earlier. And I think that is where, if organizations haven't quite understood, the use case, as you say, that's where that has not been very clear, so probably needed some more help there. But so part one very much around sort of governance. What's the control program that is in place to understand across the whole of the CDR data set, and what are the security arrangements that they're needing to put into place. And the second part, of course, being the more technical aspect in regards to those information security controls, down to really understanding what the vulnerabilities might be. Is there a testing program in there that's in place to cover all those areas? And is there sort of security training, sort of, for example, being put in place in the organization, so there's familiarity and awareness across the organization in regards to, well, we're a holder of data, we're going to be using that data. Does everyone, across that? And I think that's really, when you drill down into the detail of the Part 2 controls, is though often those things are not misunderstood, but not necessarily considered initially, because I guess you've got those very sort of high level controls, but then there's so many other controls to consider. So, I guess accreditation, the standards that are applicable, your ISO 27001, but of course that doesn't always sort of capture everything that you need to demonstrate in order to become accredited. And again, from a discussion point with clients, is getting clients to realize that sometimes that even that certification, there's some additional assurance requirements that are necessary. And Jill, I'm sure you've had that experience as well. So Tim, the other part is in regards to where there are existing sources of assurance that organizations might have, and then how can they be taking into account when you're actually supporting them with the assessment for accreditation, or readiness for accreditation, I should say.
Yeah, because I guess there'd be some people that are already doing a GS777 internal control report, and then how do you leverage that in terms of the CDR process? There's other things, if you look at other sectors in terms of operation of due diligence type reports that some of the asset managers, sort of would have. So I think it's going to be, how do you overlay some of these types of assurance, and then probably now it's probably a time for companies to take a step back and say, what's the best framework for the assurance to meet all the different requirements, rather than just bolting on, something additional.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, up to now, ASA 3150 has been the assurance standard. you could argue, is that the right, could it be a 342 or a SOC type report going forward? What's actually best for the organization, but actually delivers some value for the organization as it goes forward also. And the expectations of, recipients or parties that you might engage with as well. Well, what would they expect to see as the level of assurance that's provided?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I mean, I've worked on a lot of broker dealers, for example, and they'll prepare a GS007 report and they never send it out to anyone. So it's going to be interesting to see, the assurance reports. Obviously, you probably need to be doing from a governance perspective and a bit of a requirement, but in terms of who's going to be using it, and then I guess obviously the other issue is where there's findings, so I think it's going to be quite interesting as well as we go through this first cycle. Are there any findings on these assurance reports, which obviously will lead to a lot of questions, from probably regulators. So it's going to be quite interesting to see, what comes out of this first round.
Yeah, look, absolutely, and that's the challenge, because you want to support clients in terms of their readiness, so effectively you're providing a clean bill of health if you want in those reports, but that isn't always the case, as we're finding. So then how do you then have the conversation with the recipients of that, where there are clearly things that need rectification, and the timing of that?
But it's also a question in our own application, we, out of the 26 controls, there was I think 1 or 2 that we actually had gaps. And we're like, all right, this is why we have a gap. It's not like we're ignoring it, but this is because we have Linux and doesn't have, these type of, I think it was something about monitoring with Linux machines instead of Mac versus Windows. And how does that really work for a developer environment? Because it's also thinking about what's fit for purpose, thinking about the nature, size, scale, and complexity of everything as well. Because it's not like the regulator is demanding that, no, we have to change all the machines of the developers. That would be very unreasonable. Yes. But just thinking about even our approach to blacklisting versus whitelisting, and it's just not as black and white as I actually thought it would be. But we're this is why this works for us or it doesn't work for us, and just seeing how that goes.
Yeah, agreed. It's definitely not one size fits all, which is great, actually.
And it actually allows, I think, some flexibility in terms of how you define the environment. But I guess customers will be looking to see where the gaps are, and can they live with those gaps, and so again, more is probably going to be on some of the use cases for some of your clients, where this is going to become more of a potential issue. Mark, maybe talk a little bit about developing a CDR policy. What's your advice on that?
Yeah, actually, again, this might seem a bit obvious maybe, but I suppose firstly, it has to be separate to a privacy policy that might already be in existence, and that can be a stumbling block sometimes in terms of having that conversation. But actually, the rules, again, they do us a favor there in regards to setting out what the requirements are from a policy, or what should be included in a policy. And I guess if I focus on a data recipient, because what the requirements of a policy are different to data recipient, data holder, or a designated gateway. So I'll focus on ADR and what that is, what should be included there. But I mean, first and foremost, from a consumer perspective, they really do want to understand and have it documented in the policy what the complaints process is. How would somebody be able to complain if there was a concern in regards to the usage of their data? In terms of the access to their data, if there's any correction of their data, and I guess the policy that the organization would apply in regards to those areas. Purposes of the CDR data, what it's actually being used for, making it very clear in the policy. What are the storage practices, particularly if there are any offshore or overseas storage practices. Then, what's the policy in regards to deletion of data or the identification of CDR data? So there's quite a lot that needs to be included in those policies, and again, the expectation is that policy is made available. The public and consumers can see that policy for the organization, maybe stating the obvious that it needs to be kept up to date. And the expectation there as a minimum, it's an annual requirement, but otherwise, if there are any changes in regards to how you handle the consumer's data, then yeah, you will need to update the policy accordingly.
And I think you guys briefly mentioned, but part of the challenge is having a policy and then bringing it to life, and so I think it's going to be one of these interesting parts in terms of training programs and making, particularly as you're onboarding new people, do they understand? If there's a lot of turnover in industry, do they understand this? So I think that's going to be the next iteration.
Yeah, look, agreed on it. You can have the best policy in the world, but if it's there on the shelf or it's hidden somewhere in your intranet or whatever, then it's not going to be brought to life, and people are not going to follow that. So.
Yeah, I think, we onboarded 2 new engineers who have access to the CDR environment. So that triggered a number of things that need to happen. They have to go through we have to be given the fit and proper policy. They have to go through the fit and proper attestation. They have to go through the police checks. And they have to basically read, understand, and acknowledge our plethora of policies and processes in the information security framework. We have to add them to the CDR access register that needs to be reviewed monthly by the CTO and noted quarterly at board. So it's like, unless you have to also update your board calendar as well, like with all of these, because if I were in breach of any of those, even with the onboarding, then that would be an issue for me as a data recipient for sure. But even so, for the people that join the company, and I'm like, so we have to do police checks, and here's all the things that you have to do. Like, it's not a normal onboarding, but this is why I feel like it just brings that level of seriousness to you're accessing a CDR data environment. This is regulated, so this is what's expected.
A level of seriousness and professionalism, in terms of, I think it's just the rigor, and I think that's the challenge with being accredited and then having the policies that you have to adhere to those. And I think it's just making sure that people are ready to do so. A little bit mindful of time, so I'm going to skip around a little bit in terms of some of the questions. I guess, Jill, what are you seeing from a customer education perspective? I guess, because we kind of need the customer to pull the wagon a little bit. Are you starting to see customers become more engaged in the process, or what do you think needs to change to accelerate this?
So when you say customers, do you mean like an Adatree customer that's a business, or an end customer? That would be end customer. That's really interesting. I really hope that part of the $112 million goes into a PR campaign, because pretty much most people, if they hear about open banking or CDR, they probably have something to do with it with business. When someone's sister or mother-in-law know about this, if they didn't work in banking or technology and InfoSec, very unlikely. So I don't think that there's much knowledge about it, but at the same time, you don't know how contactless works. It just solves a problem for you when you tap your card. Screen scraping, you actually don't know how that works, but you just use it to solve the problem. So I imagine that there would be a bit of a two-stream approach of one, just bring use cases to life, and just if you present a good enough proposition, the consent process is actually incredibly prescriptive, but it's also very clear about what you're doing. Hopefully people just follow that, but they also have a CX working group to constantly update that as well. Run out of Data 61. But then the other side of it, I'm sure that Treasury would be running a PR campaign just to educate people about, oh, this is coming, especially with pretty much all ADIs except for foreign branches sharing their data very soon. Suddenly in online banking, you're going to see a consent dashboard, because not even just data recipients have a consent dashboard, data holders do. And I imagine people would be like, what is this? That's confusing. So especially for third-tier ADIs, having to educate their customers about, you're going to see a dashboard, don't worry, we're not sharing your data unless you do it. But that's something that all third-tier ADIs will be thinking about in their comms plan.
Well, it's quite interesting because it leads into a few things about the non-Big Four readiness, I guess. And if you talk about some of the one, there's been a slight delay on the timing in terms of when other ADIs come on. Do you think there's going to be a slippage, or do you think it's really going to be, sort of that July to September timeframe?
I think it will be July to September timeframe. Absolutely. There's some banks that are, that are ready, that they're definitely going through testing right now. We're talking with some as well that are even looking to leverage our data recipient platform for testing, because it's conformance and it really helps data holders test as well. So I think that July to September is very, very reasonable.
And I guess, I guess in terms of building the trust in that consumer confidence, what are you seeing sort of the non-Big Four banks doing in this particular space? Because you mentioned, explaining to customers there's going to be a dashboard. There are people understanding the opt-in, the opt-out, sort of measures. There's the $113 million that's sitting there, but July and September is not far from here. So I guess there's been some speculation that open banking really won't take hold for 3 or 5 years. Do you think that that's a realistic sort of timeline, or do you think with this move in July to September you're going to start to see the end consumers really sort of picking up their understanding?
I think that 3 to 5 years is, I personally think that that's too much. Especially the number of non-bank lenders, ADIs that I'm speaking with, and other non-financial services companies. They're looking at working on accreditation, or working on their plans, or timing for it now, because they always like to pick a point in time. They're like, oh, this is when my use case is going to be ready. This is when I'd like to receive data, especially once you have like a full total addressable market. That's much more attractive than just 4. So they're definitely looking at that. The ADIs, they're largely focusing on their must-have of sharing data, meeting their regulatory obligations, especially with Regional Australia Bank being active, with CBA now being active as well. Now the focus is, all right, let's start sharing data, and then let's think about what's a use case that's really impactful for our customers and for our business that we can deliver. So I think that is going to be, I've already been being told that that's a focus, probably a couple months after, just so they can smooth the waters, share the data, and then focus on, all right, let's not just comply, but let's compete.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of how do you think we're going to overcome some of the legacy data issues with the Big Four banks, in terms of, because I guess if we're going to get to that place of competition and the proper sharing of data, what's the best way that you think that this is going to happen?
That was interesting, because I actually feel like the Big Four have a harder time sharing data than the smaller tier ADIs, because they have it in so many different places, as opposed to just having it in your core, in one database. So your mapping is actually much more complicated. How to overcome those issues? I mean, it's definitely in the press everywhere that, say, Westpac has spent more than $200 million in their CDR program.
Yeah.
I imagine that most of that would be in getting their data ready to share in the CDR format. Because once you actually have it, once you've mapped it, you've converted it into CDR format, it's much easier to actually share. But the internal readiness, that's definitely the hard part of it. So how do they overcome that? I feel like they just have pretty big budgets, and they've been throwing people at it, and external vendors. So that definitely wouldn't be a fun time as well. But you just really hope that the benefits outweigh those costs.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting, because I think historically the big banks have always had some of the technology, sort of issues, and I think for this to be successful, clearly the Big Four have to, that flow of data has got to be transparent and accurate, and I think that's going to be quite interesting to see if that comes to fruition.
I think that it's that sort of challenge as well. I mean, I guess with the regulator looking at sort of just data reporting more broadly. So I guess working with what we're seeing is that the challenge between reporting to the regulator with the data, and actually then the investment in CDR. And you're right. I mean, there's a lot of resource and dollars being spent in those areas at the moment.
So just shifting slightly to sort of government and regulatory changes, I guess, Senator Hume took over from the ACCC. Do you have a particular view in terms of how this might be able to speed up sort of CDR adoption?
Absolutely. I think it was about 3 weeks ago today. So Treasury and ACCC have essentially split CDR responsibilities. ACCC has conformance testing, compliance, and enforcement, and the accreditation team. And then Treasury is more looking at like the rules, current rules, and then basically changes going forward. They are being incredibly collaborative, really looking at industry and seeking out views in a variety of ways. I'm really impressed with their collaboration. They're very approachable, and they're looking at they're prioritizing things as well. What will make the biggest impact? So three weeks today, or ago today, they came out with basically talking about some of the changes that they would like to make. That another consultation would definitely be coming for that, and that would be for derived data and insights, as well as looking at the affiliate sponsor model. The former, the derived data and insights, that it basically is taking the idea that, so right now, if you have CDR data, so it's transactional data, customer data, if you analyze that and turn that into, say for a credit assessment, right?
Yep.
We look at this data, and is Tim, approved for a loan? Yes. And the answer, yes, is considered CDR data, even though it has actually nothing about your transactions. And you could drive it for a number of sources. It could be screen scraping and credit bureau, but if CDR is in there, then it's CDR data. There's been a lot of feedback on that to change it, and Treasury is hearing it. So looking at how can you increase the utility? How can you have decreased risk for the customer, but still make it really useful for companies to have yes, no. Which out of the risk assessment for all the different types of data to be, outside of a CDR compliant environment, there would be a much lower risk of, a yes, no, a confirmation of a fact, or even of a score. So that is a very big industry request, and they've listened to it. So what are the details of it? We don't know, but we know that it's coming, which is I'm super happy about that for sure. And yeah, the second one is about the affiliate sponsor model. Really don't know what that looks like just yet. It was definitely talked about in the second Federal report. Just thinking about how can you maintain those technical security standards while decreasing barriers to entry as well. So I think that that one's a tricky one, right? Because some people are like, oh, I just want to access CDR data without having any controls. You're like, well, no, realistically, that won't happen. But so the idea of having an unrestricted data recipient, so that then being the sponsor, and then having more like a commercial relationship with the affiliate as well. So it could be still a smaller audit. It could be a desktop review. It could be out of stations. There's questions of where is this data stored or analyzed.
You're sounding like an auditor. You're ready to join, dropping all those reports. Yeah.
I could be so lucky.
Yeah. I think obviously the future directions report is quite interesting in terms of what's going to happen there, and I think obviously the change and the collaboration between the different agencies is going to probably give it a bit of a push, and I really probably think 2021 is going to be quite interesting in terms of the uptick. So we'll wait and see. We'll wait and see on that. There's been a couple of questions in terms of international. I guess. Jill, what's your view in terms of international companies accessing the CDR regime? So, and maybe one way to talk about it would be UK obviously has open banking. Are we starting to see the ability where, there's going to be, the regimes will be comparable or the same, which would allow for cross-border companies to use the same open banking regime?
So the dream is yes. The dream is you'd be able to refer to as passporting. You meet the requirements one, and then you can essentially work with, we'll have a presence in a different similar country, and not have to go through accreditation process in every country. Does that work right now? No. In your CDR application form, there is a question that says, oh, are you accredited in another country? So ultimately, I think that it would be easier for them to do it in Australia if they're accredited in the UK. We're definitely talking to a number of companies looking to do that exact same thing. I think that they just have so many of the controls in place and so much of the structure policies in place. So it's easier for them to just localize it, edit it, make some smaller changes than start from scratch. So they unfortunately can't just, use your UK license and start driving here, but they know how to drive. So hopefully they'll get up to speed much quicker.
And are you starting to see open, I guess in terms of if you look, we talked a little bit about 3 to 5 years for open banking in Australia. What's your sense of how quickly the UK is adopting open banking?
Well, I think that COVID actually accelerated the adoption of open banking. There's especially with the government having open banking as a payment option as well. So I think that is it being presented more to people? Well, especially since they have payments there, that makes a really big difference. Hopefully we'll have that. Well, that was a key recommendation for action initiation in the future directions report too. So hopefully we'll have that, but it's been a slower uptake in the UK, but that's because it was brand new, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely expect it to be more hockey stick in Australia than it was in the UK.
Just I guess on customer trust, Mark, what do you think are the ethical responsibilities for fintech companies in terms of data aggregation? Obviously, there's going to be some new technologies coming in relation to AI, but I think to me that's going to be the tricky point is just getting people comfortable. And I guess as a fintech, what should they be trying to do to gain that trust?
Yeah, look, I think it's going to be a bit of a challenge. Actually, I think that's my view. And on where would they look to in terms of maybe some guidance or direction around that? There's the ethics framework the government launched earlier on in 2019. Actually, it's been around for a while. Is that the right sort of source of guidance or support? We're not sure. I guess we haven't seen that as yet, but I might sort of throw that to Jill actually, just in terms of how would you deal with that, and if there were, I guess with AI, I mean, is the de-identification side of things. Well, do you then understand where we talked earlier about the whole journey and life cycle of that data, and well, how would you know, I suppose, where that is and how that's landing? But I don't know if you want to be on that, Jill, on the ethics side of things. But
and I think it's interesting because, well, with CDR, it's its own little environment, and then it's ultimately about still solving a problem for a customer. If you can use AI, if you can use technology, say to make better predictions about someone, say for switching as a service, or just identifying that someone has a change in life, or it's oh, I think that you're actually underinsured right now because of what's happening, or just different product recommendations. I think that if you can offer a better experience and something more suitable, personalized, and using AI, I think that's very much appropriate. I think you still have to, of course, abide by all the CDR policies and rules, and that's that privacy framework. That's that structure that really protects the consumers. And of course, if the ACCC or Treasury sees something that they don't like, then of course, they would change the rules accordingly as well. So I think that it's a really proactive regulator that they're watching. They'd be watching all the different use cases, technologies, and everything for it as well.
Yeah, I think it's kind of people have to trust the process, a little bit in terms of the government has to do their role in terms of making sure that people are doing things ethically. I think obviously fintechs value the culture that they have, so their ethos is sort of built on that. But I think there's going to be it's links back to that education of the end consumers and just making sure those business cases are sound. I think we're going to get some natural development of some obvious ones that people are going to become more comfortable with. And I think, to me, that's the exciting part about this particular space. We're running out of time, so I just want to ask, a final question. Jill, you were on 6 months ago. Amy has your recording and your predictions from before. What do you think is going to happen in the next 12 months for open banking? So when we sit here again a year from now, what's your sense of the market?
I think that in the next 12 months, we are going to have a flurry of accredited data recipients. We will have the sponsor affiliate model live, and that will be, I feel like that will be able to onboard hundreds of fintechs, banks, loyalty companies, payment companies, all at scale. And we will just be talking about all of our favorite live use cases in market. And then hopefully just being like, oh, when is energy coming?
Exciting times. I think it's going to be exciting. So that brings us to the end of the session. And so Jill and Mark, thank you for your insights. Hopefully everyone thought that was a very good discussion. There were a few questions that we didn't get to, so we'll look to respond and send those back out to the attendees. You'll see on screen the details for our next webinar. Next month, we're going to be talking about the federal budget in the new financial year for fintechs. The details of this webinar will be shared with you in a follow-up email from today's sessions. And if you need to watch this again, Amy and Maddie will be sending out a link. Thank you very much and have a great Friday. Thanks. Bye.